Good morning, Professor Deaton.
Good morning. How are you?
Hi, very well. I hope the same for you. Welcome.
Yes.
Welcome to the Aula Magna of the University of Bologna. We are very proud to have you as our lecturer this year. And I would like to give a welcome on the behalf of Il Mulino and thank you for accepting our invitation. Now, as you know, I will say some words in Italian to the Italian audience. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Allora, benvenuti, rinnovo il benvenuto a tutti a questa 31esima edizione del Lettura del Mulino, che è un'edizione un po' speciale, come avete capito. Prima di tutto per il prestigio del nostro ospite, il professor Angus Deaton dell'Università di Princeton, recentemente insignito del premio Nobel per l'economia. E qui non posso non dire quanto il Mulino sia orgoglioso di aver pubblicato, fin dalla scorsa primavera, il suo libro La grande fuga, salute, ricchezza e origine della disuguaglianza. È un libro di grande respiro, è un grande affresco nel tempo e nello spazio sull'eterna, incessante tensione fra disuguaglianza e progresso nella storia dell'umanità, dove si parla di ricchezza e povertà, ma non solo in termini di denaro e di reddito, ma di felicità, di salute e della possibilità di vivere abbastanza a lungo per godere delle opportunità della vita. Siamo veramente orgogliosi di aver pubblicato questo libro. E è un'occasione un po' speciale anche per la formula che, come avete visto, vede il nostro ospite in videoconferenza da Princeton e qui sul palco accanto a me due suoi illustri predecessori, nel senso che hanno tenuto delle letture in precedenti anni e sono in rigoroso ordine alfabetico il professor Massimo Livi-Bacci e il governatore della Banca d'Italia Ignazio Visco. Massimo Livi-Bacci, demografo, una lunga carriera di studio e di ricerca in vari paesi del mondo, nel continente latinoamericano, in Brasile, in Messico, negli Stati Uniti e a Princeton, se non sbaglio, proprio della stessa università in cui insegna il professor Deaton. È stato il presidente della International Union for the Scientific Study of Population e soprattutto è un convinto assertore della fecondità di un approccio interdisciplinare allo studio dei fenomeni demografici, come ha messo brillantemente in pratica nei suoi molti libri, molti tradotti all'estero, molti con il Mulino. Cito l'ultimo anche perché è uscito da pochissimi giorni ed è Il pianeta stretto, una riflessione sullo profondo squilibrio demografico che caratterizza i paesi oggi, sottolineando le conseguenze, le implicazioni sul piano politico e sociale di questo squilibrio. Come potete immaginare, pensate alla stabilità interna dei vari paesi, alle migrazioni internazionali o ai rapporti fra le nazioni. Il governatore della Banca d'Italia Ignazio Visco, che voi conoscete molto bene, è stato il lettore dello scorso anno e proprio partendo dallo scenario tracciato lo scorso anno della lettura sul grande impatto del cambiamento tecnologico nel mondo globalizzato, ha raccolto alcune sue considerazioni in tema di economia e finanza in un recente libro, anch'esso pubblicato poco tempo fa proprio, al quale ha voluto dare lo stesso titolo della lettura, perché i tempi stanno cambiando. E se posso permettermi di riassumere in una frase le sue grandi considerazioni e implicazioni, vorrei ricordare un monito, un invito che Ignazio Visco rivolge non solo ai giovani, ma ai giovani prima di tutto, che è quello di cogliere le opportunità, non solo i rischi del cambiamento. Quindi due interlocutori ideali per il professor Deaton, sul quale però sarà Monica Albertoni a tracciare un breve profilo perché Monica Albertoni, editor del Mulino, è la persona che ha proposto per l'edizione italiana la grande fuga, con grande lungimiranza, ne ha seguito la realizzazione e ha mantenuto sempre i contatti col professor Deaton in tutto questo tempo, anche in vista dell'organizzazione, della lettura. Per cui passo il microfono a Monica.
Buongiorno, come avete sentito il mio compito oggi è di presentare il professor Deaton ai pochi, immagino, che ancora non lo conoscessero. Parlerò in italiano, quindi mi affido alla traduzione di Paolo Maria Noseda. Ho pensato che il modo più facile per presentare il professor Deaton e la sua opera fosse ricordare la motivazione con cui gli è stato assegnato il premio Nobel poche settimane fa. E dunque per la sua analisi del consumo, della povertà e del welfare. Per progettare una politica economica che promuove il benessere e riduca la povertà, dobbiamo prima capire le scelte di consumo individuali. Più di chiunque altro, Angus Deaton ha ampliato e migliorato questa comprensione. Infatti abbiamo conosciuto il professor Deaton negli anni '80, quando ha pubblicato insieme a Mühlbauer il testo, direi fondamentale, Economics and Consumer Behavior. E nel '91 quando ha pubblicato Understanding Consumption, e ancora di nuovo sul consumo e sul comportamento delle famiglie nel '97 col suo Analysis of Household Surveys. Per la verità, inizialmente il professor Deaton si era avvicinato a studi di matematica. Soltanto dopo aver incontrato John Stone, a sua volta in seguito insignito del premio Nobel, si è avvicinato agli studi di economia. Con lui ha iniziato a fare ricerca e da lì sono maturati articoli, lavori scientifici di grandissimo rilievo che credo tutti gli economisti presenti in sala conoscano benissimo. Forse vale la pena anche dare una nota biografica. Il professor Deaton è nato a Edimburgo, dove ha iniziato i suoi studi, che ha poi proseguito a Cambridge, dove ha insegnato, dopo aver insegnato a Bristol. Nell'83 si è trasferito negli Stati Uniti, dove tuttora vive, insegna nell'Università di Princeton ed è professore di economia e affari internazionali. È membro, devo leggere, è membro della British Academy, della American Academy of Arts and Sciences e dell'Econometric Society. Non meno importante, è stato presidente dell'American Economic Society. Ha ricevuto la Frisch Medal e il premio Frontiers of Knowledge. Ma non basta, riconoscimenti non gli arrivano solo dall'ambito dell'economia. Infatti nel 2014 viene eletto membro dell'American Philosophical Society e nel 2015 della National Academy of Sciences. Anche in Italia ha avuto un riconoscimento. Nel 2007 ha ricevuto la laurea honoris causa dall'Università di Roma Tor Vergata. Tuttavia il primo libro tradotto in italiano è La grande fuga, che abbiamo pubblicato qualche mese fa, come diceva Giovanna, non senza un po' di orgoglio. Forse posso fermarmi qui, ma permettetemi di ringraziare personalmente il professor Deaton per la gentilezza che ci ha sempre riservato. In questi mesi è stato bersagliato di telefonate, richieste, mail, domande a cui non si è mai sottratto. Voglio poi ringraziarlo, credo a nome di tutti, per aver accettato di alzarsi così presto questa mattina, perché non dimentichiamo che negli Stati Uniti è l'alba ed è già qui collegato da un'ora. Quindi lo ringrazio moltissimo, evidentemente lui ha capito l'importanza che noi attribuiamo a questo incontro, quindi lo ringrazio sentitamente, molto sinceramente, anche personalmente. Quindi un grazie sincero, sperando di averlo presto in Italia. Grazie.
Grazie Monica, e adesso finalmente la parola al professor Deaton. I would like to invite you to speak, Professor Deaton.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for those wonderful words of introduction. I should start by apologizing. I should have much preferred to be there with you than to be sitting here in Princeton. Unfortunately, I have a problem with my right hip, and that is going to be replaced. I think of it as my Christmas present. So let me talk about the Great Escape and whether we can really expect it to continue into the future. In the midst of all the horrors around us today, the refugee crisis in Europe and the Middle East, instability, civil war in Syria, 700 million people living in destitution, and rising inequality almost everywhere, it is easy to forget just how much better off we are, than were our grandparents, their grandparents, and the many generations before. We often think of destitution as the utter lack of material resources, but it also means ill health. It means children dying before they become adults, and adults dying before they have a chance to become grandparents. Politics is better too. Democracy has spread, and as the psychologist and linguist Steven Pinker has documented, there's been a huge decrease in violence, certainly on a personal level, the freedom from the risk of being attacked and murdered, but also in wars and famines, at least as a fraction of the population. Traditional patterns of discrimination are also breaking down against women, against blacks, against lower castes and untouchables, and against homosexuals. Famines are much less frequent than ever, and those that do happen today are almost all associated with wars and with politics. So we should stop paying attention only to today's news with its focus on disasters. In a more considered view, life has been getting better for a very long time. In this lecture, I want to tell the story of some episodes of progress, of how specific challenges were met, and how and why improvement happened. I also want to emphasize the unevenness of progress, both over time, there have been sometimes terrible setbacks, and over people, progress brings inequality when some get the benefits before others. Inequality is an incentive to progress, but it's also a threat to it. Those who get ahead first, who have come up with a successful new invention or who find a new way of implementing an idea, often get rich and open up a gap over everyone else. If the rich are first to get a new effective treatment, a health gap will open up between them and those who don't get it. Those gaps spur those left behind to succeed too, and are powerful forces for general progress. That is the good side of inequality. But sometimes those who've done well turn around and try to preserve what they have by stopping others from succeeding, by passing laws in their own interest, or by trying to capture the government. If they succeed, inequality becomes a brake on progress, with a few groups lining their pockets at the expense of the population as a whole, a process described in the 1960s and 70s by the economist and social scientist Mansur Olson. I also want to talk about the threats that face us today and whether or not we are safe from a return to destitution. Even better, can we expect life to be even better in the future? And can we expect the escape to lift up people in places where there really has never been progress? Historians now believe that through most of human history, there was little material progress. For thousands of years, people just scraped by or did not. People rarely had more food than they needed. Almost a half of children did not survive to become adults. and adults suffered chronic morbidity throughout their lives. In some places and sometimes, people did better. The historian Ian Morris has described the high life of citizens of Kaifeng in China in the 11th century, who lived in a smoke-filled city with hundreds of theaters and with mass production of books. The age of empire in the 16th and 17th century was, quotes, won by Britain and by Holland. So that by 1750, as documented by the economic historian Robert Allen, laborers in London and Amsterdam had seen their incomes grow relative to laborers in Delhi, Beijing, Valencia, and Florence. And English workers could even afford a few luxuries, such as sugar and tea. Yet until the 18th century, such episodes never lasted. One or two generations made progress, but their children and grandchildren slipped back into destitution. Many places never even saw temporary good fortune. The average height of Indians born around 1950, which is an indicator of nutrition in childhood, of your mother's nutrition and of her mother's nutrition, was almost as low as any in recorded history, shorter than the European average in 1860, and only a few centimeters taller than the record lows recorded for contemporary Bushmen in Africa, and of all people, Norwegians in 1761. It is likely that the deprivation in childhood of Indians born around 1950 was as severe as that of any large group in history, all the way back to the Neolithic Revolution and the hunter-gatherers that preceded them. Around 1750, there was a change that was the beginning of our prosperity today. There are many different accounts, but the European Enlightenment certainly played a part. People began shaking off their unthinking obedience to the church and to the throne, and began to pursue their own prosperity and their own happiness in their own ways. They became more open to new ideas and to new ways of doing things. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain and spread to the Netherlands, the United States, and to the rest of Northwest Europe, brought continuing economic growth for the first time in human history. There are two aspects of the Industrial Revolution that I want to note here. The first is the story of the health improvements that came with it, so that improvements in material living standards came with improvements to longevity. I do not believe that health improvements were caused by growth, rather that both came from the same underlying forces of practical scientific inquiry, of useful knowledge. The second is the story of the Great Divergence, of the huge increase in global inequality, much of which remains with us today. One of the best stories of that period is about smallpox, today eliminated from the world, but a great scourge through human history. In England, before the 18th century, almost everyone got smallpox, though most survived. A lady of the court of George I, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, a famous beauty of her day, herself suffered smallpox as an adult in 1715. As the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey, she saw the procedure known as variolation or inoculation. Infected material is taken from a victim of smallpox and is rubbed under the skin of a healthy person who, if they are fortunate, acquire lifetime immunity against the disease. King George, after experimenting on prisoners and on abandoned children, allowed his own grandchildren to be variolated, and none of them died. The practice spread through the British aristocracy in the 18th century, and because of it and other medical innovations, including after 1799 Jenner's vaccination, the life expectancy of aristocrats in Britain rose by 25 years between 1750 and 1850. Many of these new procedures were extremely expensive when first introduced, and so were not available to ordinary people. Prior to 1750, the aristocrats live no longer than the general population. Money and power are no protection against death unless there is a useful knowledge that money or power can access. And it was in the production of useful knowledge that the Enlightenment excelled. As soon as the methods became available, inequalities in power and in wealth turned into inequalities in health. We see the same today. In many cases, it is the better off and better educated who are the first to access a new method of screening or new preventative drugs. British inequalities in income and in health were insignificant compared to the inequalities that the Industrial and Health Revolution brought to the world. As Britain, North America, and Northwestern Europe pulled ahead, huge gaps in per capita GDP and in life expectancy opened up between the leading countries and those left behind. To a large extent, the gaps between countries that we see today are a result, or at least the echo, of Europe's Great Escape that began a quarter of a millennium ago. These inequalities in health, in living standards, and in political stability between Europe on the one hand and Africa and Asia on the other hand generate intense pressure for people to try to migrate to Europe. The World Bank keeps track of the number of poor people in the world, or at least the number of people whose material poverty falls below a destitution level. In October this year, last month, the World Bank released its latest estimate that there are 902 million people, or 12.8% of the world's population, who live on less than $1.90 per person per day. Although $1.90 may seem puzzling for those used to $1.25 a day or $1 a day, I believe that the bank is correct when it says that $1.90 bought the same in the poorest countries of the world in 2011 as did the previous line of $1.25 in 2005. So while there are certainly grounds for debate about where the line should be set, and thus on the number of people in destitution, there is no doubt that the number has fallen dramatically over the last quarter century. Progress in material poverty reduction has been most rapid in China, and to a lesser but still very real extent in India, the two largest countries in the world. But in recent years, Africa, long the lagging region with 42% poverty in 2012, has also shown a good deal of poverty reduction. With Africa, it should always be noted that the data are often weak, and there is always more uncertainty about measuring growth and poverty in Africa than in other regions of the world. As material poverty has declined in the poor world, health has improved. The germ theory of disease, which was worked out in Europe in the late 19th century, brought its very late benefits to Africa and to Asia after World War II, when children began to be routinely vaccinated, disease vectors were brought under better control, and the benefits of clean water became more widely understood. Fewer and fewer newborns died as infants or as children. There is no country in the world where infant or child mortality rates were higher in 2010 than in 1950. Life expectancy has risen more rapidly in the poor world than it has in the rich world. Of course, this higher relative rate is driven largely by the decline in infant and child mortality, which was accomplished long ago in the rich countries, and by the fact that saving young lives has a much bigger effect on life expectancy than does saving middle-aged or old lives. And there has been less catching up of mortality rates in those older groups. There have been improvements in rich country health too. In Western Europe and in North America, people are less likely to smoke than 50 years ago, and they are more likely to use drugs to control their blood pressure and cholesterol. Both behavior and treatment have contributed to rapid declines in heart disease and have helped lengthen lives in rich countries by 2 to 3 years every decade. We have already seen real progress against lung cancer, particularly for men who quit smoking earlier, and more recently against other forms of cancer too. so that further gains in life expectancy are likely. Of course, getting better does not mean that everybody is already better. There are still countries where too many children die, where clean water and sanitation are not available, and where governments are not capable of delivering routine health care, particularly for mothers and infants, including routine vaccinations. In India, children are far too small, and in 2006, almost half of all Indian children were severely stunted, or more precisely, more than 2 standard deviations below the normal height for age. Africa may be growing, but per capita income is astonishingly low, and poverty rates remain the highest in the world. The Great Escape was not smooth. There have been reversals even within modern times, when wars and epidemics have taken the lives of millions, and when economic depression stopped economic growth in its tracks and brought years of unemployment and misery. These episodes are not behind us. Europeans are only too aware today of the consequences of the Great Recession that began in the United States in 2008, and the waves of austerity and unemployment that have followed and that still continue. Nor is our health safe. It used to seem that the great medieval plagues were safely behind us, with cholera in the 19th century the last serious affliction. But the HIV/AIDS epidemic has reminded us that this is not so. Last year, the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, although never a real threat outside of the region, provided a sharp and unpleasant reminder that plagues may be asleep, but they are not dead. Still, one of the greatest risks to our health and our well-being comes from politics gone wrong, what I call toxic politics, which can kill as many people as the worst epidemic. A catastrophe from not so long ago was the so-called Great Leap Forward in China from 1958 to 1961. Deeply misguided industrialization and food procurement policies by Mao Zedong and his cadres led to the death of around 35 million people and prevented the births of perhaps 40 million more. Weather conditions were not unusual in those years. The catastrophe was entirely man-made. Mao was determined that China would overtake the production levels of Russia and of Britain within a few years, and to try to do so, implemented fantastical policies of collectivization and a manufacturing that could only, and did, reduce production and bring mass starvation. One might hope that when the effects of such policies became apparent, they would have been abandoned or at least modified, but one would have hoped in vain. When Mao learned of what was happening, though perhaps not of its full scale, instead of backing off, he doubled down and purged those who brought the bad news or argued for change. Life expectancy, which had been around 50 in 1958, fell to below 30 in 1960, and once the killing stopped, it bounced back to almost 55 in 1965. In China from 1958 to 1961, bad policies in a totalitarian system caused tens of millions to die. Without democratic feedback and without a free press, the disaster could be hidden and could not be protested, and it took a long time to be reversed. Could the same thing happen today? If not in China, then somewhere else. One thing that would certainly be different is that 55 years later, the world would know that it was happening. Whether the world could do anything about it is another matter. As the world has prospered, at least on average, famines have become increasingly rare. Almost all recent famines have been attributable not to weather or to harvest failure, but to wars, or like the Chinese famine, to toxic politics. They will not easily vanish from the earth. Life has been improving for a long time now, starting in a few countries and spreading slowly to the rest of the world. Yet 250 years is only a tiny fraction of human history, during most of which there was little or no progress, or more accurately, there were periods of progress, none of which lasted. Various catastrophes stopped those flashes of light from turning into permanent illumination. Wars were often the catastrophes, or catastrophes were wrought by politicians who choked off the growth in their own interest, as has been extensively documented by the historian Eric Jones and by the economist and political scientist Doron Acemoglu and James Robinson. Can we really be sure that the Great Escape really is the new normal? That it's not just a long episode that can be snuffed out like earlier, albeit shorter episodes? Before I discuss the threats that could stop the escape, I want to return to one of my earlier themes, that progress usually brings inequality. In today's age of inequality and of rapid innovation, this is truer than ever. The new technologies are benefiting some, but leaving many behind. New waves of globalization are meeting some inordinately rich, new waves of globalization are making some people inordinately rich and doing nothing at all for many others. In most, although not all, of the middle income and rich countries in the world, income inequality has been increasing, with particularly large increases at the very top of the income distribution. This has been most obvious and most pronounced in the United States, but is taking place even in countries in Europe that have long resisted rising inequality. The increasingly powerful forces of expanding inequality have overcome even strong redistributive systems in the countries that use them. At the same time, the enormous historical gaps in incomes between countries are still present, and if diminishing, data problems make it unclear, are doing so slowly at best. These levels of inequality are directly or indirectly implicated in the threats that threaten our futures. Climate change is perhaps the greatest and most obvious threat. Ironically, climate change is itself another consequence of the Great Escape. As industrialization spreads from the few to the many, the adaptability of the Earth is being stretched to and perhaps beyond its limit. Income inequality is one of the factors that makes it so difficult to forge international agreements to tackle climate change. Oil companies and automobile manufacturers are well-funded and effective lobbyists in rich countries, particularly the United States, and they will use their wealth to protect their interests against the general good. Inequality between countries is a problem too, because although the burden of remediation must be shared, the resources to do so are far from equal. Why should poor countries forego their great escape so that rich countries, let me start that sentence again. Why should poor countries forego their great escape, the one that rich countries have already enjoyed, in the interests of reducing global warming? Many would likely trade climate change deterioration for higher living standards, while the rich countries see no reason to redistribute their riches to bribe the Indians and Chinese to stop polluting. As so often, those who have the wealth are primarily interested in preserving their own position, even if it harms everyone else. My second threat is slowing economic growth. Decade by decade, the rate of growth of per capita income has been falling, even before the Great Recession that began in 2008. We really don't know exactly why it is happening, but we at least understand some of the forces at work. After World War II, there was a catch-up for countries that had suffered wartime destruction. No one had forgotten how to do things so that such growth could be rapid, because it did not have to wait until new technologies were discovered and developed. Demography has also been important. Most rich countries are aging, and high ratios of the elderly, many of whom are dissaving rather than saving, and whose consumption relies on the incomes of others through pay-as-you-go state pension subsidies, tend to slow growth. There is also an argument that technical change is slowing down that most of the best innovations are behind us, and that today's information-based inventions, important as they seem to us, are small scale compared with the great innovations of the past. Other expectations are directly to do with inequality. One is that growth that arose mostly towards the rich. One is that growth that accrues mostly toward the rich generates slower growth than would growth that was more equally shared, if only because the marginal propensity to spend of the rich is lower than that of the poor. Beyond that, two important sectors of the economy, finance and healthcare, have become larger than is socially desirable. Both sectors provide services that are incredibly valuable, but much of what they produce has more private than social value. Their size and profitability powers up inequality and comes with political power that makes it almost impossible to tame them and to stop them becoming even larger and more profitable, let alone reducing them to a more appropriate size. Larry Summers has prominently argued that too much finance, particularly speculative finance, generates bubbles and crashes that undermine the conditions for steady growth. Finance is also absorbing much of the top talent in the economy, diverting our most talented young people to activities where the gain that they bring to themselves is often a great deal larger than the gain that they bring to society. The wealth that comes from finance or from pharmaceutical companies or from medical device manufacturers or from more and more consolidated hospitals boosts income inequality and boosts the political power of the institutions, and so on. All of this is most pronounced in the United States, but the issue is serious in other countries, all of which have to decide how to cover the increased costs of valuable innovations while aligning social and private benefits and reining in the rent-seeking that comes with them. Final thread I want to talk about is a new epidemic. Those of us who are fortunate enough to live in the rich world have become used to constant improvements in health, reductions in mortality rates, and increases in life expectancy. Most of us can see it in our own families, looking back to our grandparents and great-grandparents, listing the illnesses that they had and how long they lived. Absent these decreases in mortality since 1900, half of the American population would not be here today, either because they had been born and died, or because their parents did not live long enough to have them as their children. If we look at the data since World War II, we can see that with some exceptions, for example, associated with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, all age groups have seen mortality decline, including the elderly. Yet something both unexpected and deeply disturbing has happened in the US over the last 15 years. My colleague Ann Case and I have been studying changes in the death rates of middle-aged Americans. Contrary to the decline in the past, mortality rates for those aged 45 to 54 have been increasing steadily since 1998. We calculate that this epidemic has so far cost around 500,000 lives. This is our estimate of the number of people who would not have died if mortality rates had gone on decreasing at the same rate as they did in the 30 years before 1998. This loss of life is similar to, but a little smaller than the number of people who have died from AIDS. But unlike the AIDS epidemic, has attracted comparatively little attention, at least before our paper was published last week. And in the last few days, it's attracted an enormous amount of attention. This epidemic is unusual because it's almost entirely confined to whites. The mortality rate of African Americans and of Hispanics has continued to fall at its long-term rate. It is also an entirely American story. We see no change in the rate of decline of mortality in Canada or any of the other rich European countries, including Italy. From what are the middle-aged people dying? Not lung cancer nor heart disease, mortality from both of which is falling. Not diabetes, where mortality is flat. not murders nor traffic accidents, both of which are falling. The cause of death that is responsible for the biggest increase is accidental poisonings from drugs, both prescription drugs, mostly high-octane painkillers, and illegal drugs like heroin, also from alcohol. Close behind these comes a rapid rise in middle-aged suicides, followed by increases in mortality from cirrhosis and other liver diseases. At the same time, we see increases in self-reported pain, disability, and declines in the ability to do the everyday tasks of living and working. The mechanisms underlying this epidemic are currently not clear. Overprescription of pain-killing but potentially addictive opioids is clearly part of the story, as is the wave of cheap, high-quality heroin that has been sweeping across the United States from news sources in Mexico. Yet the increase in pain may be a cause of these things as well as a consequence. It is almost as if there were an epidemic of despair among white, middle-aged Americans. What do all these horrors have to do with inequality? Well, quite a lot, it turns out. For one thing, almost all of the additional mortality is among those who are the least educated. Those with some college or with a college degree are relatively unaffected. Many of the people who are dying live in depressed, rural parts of the United States and have only a high school degree or less. They are the very people who are bearing the brunt of the increase in inequality, whose long-term economic prospects have been poor for a long time, and who have benefited not at all from the increase in average national income. There is another, more difficult to establish and more controversial link with inequality. At least some of the epidemic is the result of irresponsible marketing by rich and well-connected pharmaceutical companies who are selling what is in effect legalized heroin. One company, Purdue, was fined $600 million, and 4 of its top executives were convicted of criminal charges relating to misleading advertising that falsely claimed that their drug, OxyContin, is not addictive. Some have drawn a parallel between the illegal Mexican opiate distributors and the legal American opioid distributors, suggesting that the ethics are much the same in both cases, and that only the legal protection is different. Pharmaceutical companies and the drugs they have developed have brought enormous benefits to Americans and to others around the world. But if their profit and political clout allow them to commit crimes with impunity, and the fines are a small fraction of the profits, then our protectors have gone rogue, and our saviors have become criminals. So what is the end summary? Are we doomed, or can we continue to make progress? So to me, in spite of these and other threats that I have not talked about, I remain modestly optimistic. The deepest forces behind the Great Escape, humans' desire for freedom and their ingenuity in ensuring it, will continue to work for better lives. Even when catastrophes strike and much is lost, basic knowledge remains, and it can be used to rebuild. Democracy is under threat from inequality. Justice Louis Brandeis famously stated that the United States could have either democracy or wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but not both. Brandeis' proposition is being put to the test in the United States today. But even here, democracy is remarkably resilient. There is great wealth on both sides of many issues, and the outcomes of elections remain hard to predict or control. I do not think that our futures are secure, but I do not believe that the Great Escape is one more brief flash of prosperity that will be long forgotten 1,000 years from now. Thank you very much indeed.
Many thanks Many thanks, Professor Deaton, for your stimulating lecture. It has been a great pleasure to hear you. And now, Professor Massimo Livibacci will address some remarks and some questions to you.
Professor Deaton, I have listened with the greatest pleasure to your presentation, and I have read with the greatest interest your recent book, The Great Escape. I think it is a very stimulating and analysis that will help us to understand the patterns of modern development. But in today's presentation, you have underlined the crucial role of improved health, survival, and longevity in determining mankind's progress during the last couple of centuries. And indeed, these are the integral and the irreplaceable components of human capital. And I think they are a cornerstone for development. And good public policies may extend the benefits of a healthier and longer life to the poor countries, and particularly to those populations that are now living in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Southern Asia, where that are lagging behind the rich countries in terms of survival. And as far as the rich countries are concerned, however, you seem to be less sanguine and less optimistic about the future. And in your opinion, in North America, healthcare has become larger than it is socially desirable. These are your words. And you have cited the worrying case of the reversal in survival among middle-aged Americans, white Americans, in the last couple of decades. Partly imputable, and I quote what you have said, to irresponsible marketing by rich and well-connected pharmaceutical companies, overuse of legal and illegal drugs, the overprescriptions of painkillers, etc., etc. This view, however, goes against the common consensus that is shared by many experts that are confident that the expectation of life and longevity will be extended beyond 90 years of age by the end of the century. So they believe that the mankind has in store further progresses for survival. And indeed, recent projections assume that expectation of life may be as high as 95 years by the end of the century. Now, I think that extended survival is not a simple achievement, because it is the function and the fruit of a continuous incremental accumulation of scientific knowledge, of technical innovations, of good personal behaviors, of good nutrition, of safe environment, and of course of availability of material resources, and also I would say efficient social action. But I think two major factors could jeopardize the enormous advances that survival has achieved during the last century, and cripple further progress and maybe generate new inequalities. I think that the first is any unforeseen modification in the system of pathologies. Through the emergence, you have mentioned the emergence of HIV, AIDS, and many other pathologies have reemerged. And somehow this is a threat to the pathological system that is changing all the time, because there is a continuous interaction between the four major players. That's it, the microbes, vectors, the environment, and the human host. So this interaction is continuously being modified, and nobody knows what waits us around the corner, although we are generally optimistic that these threats may be controlled for. And on the other hand, the long life enjoyed by rich countries, where the expectation of life of both sexes is now beyond age 80 years, is largely due to the existence of modern, efficient, comprehensive, democratically accessible health systems. Now, the functionality of these health systems may be threatened by the rising costs and by the aging of the population. And in as much as this rising cost may reduce investment and may somehow compromise the role of the public, of the state in supporting public health, or may cause a retrenchment, restriction of the accessibility of the healthcare systems, I think more inequality and more vulnerability is going to be generated. And therefore, those reversal that you have noted for North America may be replicated in other rich countries. So this seemed to me one major challenge of political, social, and economic nature. And I would like to know what is your position on this point. You have said that you are, if I recall well, moderately optimistic. My second question relates to the issues of global warming. Now, you have remarked, and again I quote what you have said, why should poor countries forego the great escape that rich countries have already enjoyed in the interest of reducing global warming? Many would likely trade climate deterioration for higher living standard. And this is a very crucial point. According to the latest United Nations population projections, the population of Sub-Saharan Africa is going to double in the next 30 years, by the year 2045, from 1 billion now to 2 billion then. And if the birth rate remained at the current levels, that population would almost triple in the same interval. So, and this compares with an increase of 20% only, let's say, for the rest of the world. This growth, I think, may be unsustainable under two profiles. That these two profiles partly, of course, they partly overlap. And the first, I think, is the slowing down, the dismounting of what I would call, with an old-fashioned term, the Malthusian Trap. In other words, that negative spiral or vicious circle of hunger, poverty, high infant mortality, high fertility, more growth, and again, more poverty. And dismounting this trap in which the African populations are held prisoners, I think it's a priority for the world. And so I wonder whether this is not one major problem that we should somehow face. And the second point relates to the environmental unsustainability of current African economic growth. Any additional dollars accruing to that population's miserable income is going to be spent in goods that have a high content of energy and commodities. Oil for cooking, heating, or transportation, or metal for metal tools for working, or shoes for walking, food, of course, and other commodities that, let's say, for which the dematerialization is either impossible or minimal. And since the environmental impact of mankind is a multiplicative function of population growth and income growth, I think that in the next generations for these African populations, the impact on the environment is going to be multiplied by 10 or 20 times. So I think here, and I terminate on this point, I think there are two possible strategies. The first one concerned population policies that may curb the birth rate much faster than it is foreseen. And when I say social policies, I don't mean family planning policies alone, but policies concerning the education or the schooling of children, the vaccination of children, autonomy of women, and also some supports for the old generations that may not be on the shoulders of the middle generations. Experience shows that many countries have benefited from an acceleration of these policies, and the birth rate has declined faster than it was forecasted before. So I think this is one possible strategy. Many African countries have announced this kind of policies, but they have never enacted them with sufficient determination. And therefore, the impact has been very, very slight, if an impact has existed at all. And the second priority, I would say, it concerns the acceleration of technological innovation and technological transfers in order to accelerate the dematerialization of production and consumption. And I wonder what are your views concerning the chances that these courses of policies may be undertaken in the future and whether they could be successful or not. Thank you for listening to us.
Ecco, è riapparso il professore. Please, can we wait for your reply?
I'm sorry, I thought you would have both commentaries first. So thank you very, very much. Professor Massimo Livi-Bacci's work has always been a guiding light for me, and I benefited enormously when doing the work for The Great Escape from reading what he's written in the past. Let me just make a couple of points. One is that it's true that we've all come to believe that there's this inevitable progress in life expectancy. And the numbers that Professor Livi-Bacci quoted, that a life expectancy of 90 years or 95 years seem very much in sight. I think that's why so many of us were so startled to discover this increase in middle-age mortality rates in the United States, which is not built into these projections at all and is really quite extraordinary. It's also interesting to note what that is to do with. I mean, that is to do with addiction, it's to do with suicides, it's to do with people drinking too much and taking too many drugs, especially people with relatively low education. Many of those people's lives have not gone very well in the past 20, 30, 40 years. So one story that you could put behind this is that in spite of all the improvements in healthcare, all the improvements in science, all the improvements in technology, which are driving this increase in life expectancy, we should be very careful not to neglect behavioral responses to bad things that are happening in society. And, you know, one of the things that Professor Livi-Bacci has written about in his work over time is this very subtle interaction of sort of science, technology, microbes, and the way that people behave, which is the only sensible way to understand what's going on here. But the science by itself is not going to save us if people behave badly. And it's not just epidemics like HIV/AIDS, but it's epidemics of disastrously self-destructive behavior where people are killing themselves either rapidly or slowly. I think what we're seeing now, of course, is confined to the United States, which is really good news for Europe. But once again, it ought to be an indication, a canary in the coal mine, that things can go seriously wrong. It also should re-emphasize there are many people in the US and elsewhere who really believe that the keys to life expectancy lie in pure science, pure technology, pure bench science, discovering new microbes, cures for diseases. And this is emphasizing that that's not entirely the case, that you neglect behavior at your peril. So let me say something about Sub-Saharan Africa and the growth there and the growth of population and the threat that it might pose for the future. There clearly are threats there. One of the things, again, that has changed very recently is that, at least according to the official data, there's been really quite rapid growth over the last 10 or 15 years in Sub-Saharan Africa. I say according to the official data because in one of the things, many things that doesn't work very well in Africa are statistical services, and many of these data are very weak. They're sometimes made up. They're sometimes revised by enormous and ridiculously enormous amounts. However, if that growth is real, and let's for the moment suppose it is, then I think, I'm enough of an economist to believe that some of the issues of fertility will resolve if that growth is really real, because people will have better things to do than have very large numbers of children. And also they will see, as people in India and people in China and throughout Asia have seen, that their children have opportunities new opportunities that will help move them upwards in the world, and especially if they get educated. So the very long lagging behavior in Africa of 2 decades of negative or zero growth and very little progress in education, we can reasonably hope, and there are signs, will be reversed in the future. Of course, then that comes to the other half of the problem, that if Africa is growing very rapidly, then it's going to pollute more, and that'll be a real threat to the planet. I mean, one good part about that is that Africa, is relatively lightly populated. The living standards are very low, and even with a certain amount of growth, it's going to take a long time before it reaches the pollution levels, the contributions to global warming that we're seeing elsewhere. I'm all for the sort of population policies that Professor Levy-Bacci talked about, women's autonomy, more education, more opportunities for growth. But, one of the most important aspects of the Great Escape is the freedom that comes with it, and indeed freedom itself. And I think we have to be very careful not to replicate some of the errors of the past, in which our enthusiastic attempts to bring down population growth really seriously impinged on the freedom of people in an incredibly important part of their lives, which is to decide how many children they want to have. So I'm fairly hopeful about Africa, but I wish the data were better. So thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. No, il governatore della Banca d'Italia farà alcune osservazioni e rivolgerà alcune domande al professor Deaton. A te.
Well, first of all, good morning, Angus. It has been a really empathic, wide-ranging, stimulating lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like to start from going back to a few remarks that I happened to make in the same place where we are today last year, and it had to do with the direction and the challenges of technical change. I understand that you emphasize very much the importance of accumulated knowledge for improving the standard of living of the world population, both on the material standards and health conditions. And I understand that you have a view that is, as you say, somewhat optimistic, even if not fully optimistic, about the future and the progress of society. On the other hand, you seem to somehow lean towards a view somehow skeptical of the ability of technological progress really to lead us to a much better world. Indeed, you have emphasized both sides, seems to me, listening to you now, of the stagnationist thesis. One side is the one that somehow considers innovations somewhat faltering and productivity slowing down. You explicitly mentioned that. And another is the one that emphasizes the legacies of the financial crisis. You mentioned Larry Summers' observations about finance, about speculative finance. I think we have done a lot of work trying to regulate it more, and we are going to do more on that. You also mentioned pharmaceutical industries, the role of big pharma and so on. But somehow the conclusion of these views on the demand side, I'll say, is that there is little investment desire and much propensity to save increases that may lead to some stagnation in the future, perhaps a longer future than we would like. And at the same time, you clearly mentioned the view that on the supply side, the slowdown in productivity is important. There is a second view, I would say, that instead somehow suggests that we may be entering in a new stage of development, where technology advances are paramount, both on the side of the communication and information technologies, digitalization and robotics on one side, and also on the side of improvements in know-how, in knowledge, accumulated knowledge, artificial intelligence and genomics. All this is very much with us today. We still perhaps do not appreciate the possibilities, the enormous possibilities for progress that are associated with that. This view is the view of the second machine age. And I'd like to understand what you think about that. There is associated with that, I believe, a fear and the challenge that we have to face. The fear is that with automation, robotics, and so on, well, perhaps massive job losses may occur. And these losses in jobs are the losses in routine jobs, the ones that are mostly applied in manufacturing, and also in some services, by the way, with somehow a tendency to increase competition on non-routine manual jobs, which are low paid, which may have consequences on wages that may somehow reduce further the earnings from these jobs, not fully or really partially compensated by the increase in jobs associated with non-routine tasks of an abstract kind, the one who are very well paid, the one of researchers, the one of innovators and so on, but which perhaps may not be sufficient for some long time to compensate for the former. So at the end, the risk is that aggregate demand may falter, and there might be not enough possibilities really in terms of purchasing power that may even sustain the incredible increase in productivity that we may see. Basically, the extreme question is who will purchase all these goods and services that will be produced by robots? What do you think about that? I put this question because I think it is related to 2 points that you mentioned. One is the distribution issues, the inequality. Basically, if income and wealth will be concentrated much more than they are now today because of this development in terms of innovation and machines, what policies can be thought about to somehow counter this? But the second is also to do with the great escape that you so neatly and so well emphasized in your book and your lecture today, a great escape from poverty, which is mostly a great escape of poverty in what we used to call the third world, developing countries, emerging economies. In the last quarter of a century, you emphasized a reduction, a massive reduction in extreme poverty and destitution. Almost a billion people escaped that. Perhaps to that we have to add 2 billion people that were born in the last 25 years. So it is a massive result, a great result. But what is the threat that this great escape might be reversed? And what is the threat that may be reversed exactly in those countries which had a tremendous rate of growth in the last 25 years, thanks to a globalization that has implied perhaps some problems for advanced economies, but certainly has taken out from poverty masses of population in those economies. The question is important because this economy's growth model basically has been one based on manufacturing. Manufacturing, a labor-intensive production of goods and services, and one, as it has been said also by Massimo, that has grossly exploited raw materials and oil production, for example. Now with the climate change challenge, with the debates that we are facing, who will suffer more? And this question is related really to the optimism that you have about the Great Escape continuing in the future. I'll be very interested in your views on the three things. First, what you think about the direction and challenges of technology. The second is on income distribution and on wealth distribution. Where are the limits? Have we passed the limits? But what kind of policies one can be seen to go back within, for you, a reasonable level of inequality, that which has producing incentives for social mobility rather than the one that threatens that. And finally, what you think about explicit policies on innovation on the part of governments, the ones that are, for example, in a controversial way put out recently by Tony Atkinson, when he says that direction, a technological change should be an explicit concern of policymakers, and these policymakers should encourage innovation that increases the employability of workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's always a great joy to know that the conduct of the world is held in such hands as Ignazio's, who I've known for a long time. And it's wonderful to see such people making the decisions to help control the financial sector and the things that really are so very important. Let me take up one or two of the points in just a few minutes. So there is this wonderful, great debate going on whether technical progress has really slowed down or whether it's actually speeded up, and the best is still to come. I'm really on the positive, optimistic side here. I think there's a lot of technical progress going on. I think we have a real problem in that much of it is not very well measured. So, for example, I'm talking to you from my office in Princeton. 5 years ago, I could not have done that. I doubt very much that this ability is captured in our GDP statistics. And I think there's a lot of things like that. We all have these devices, the smartphones, the iPads, and so on, which is very fashionable to say are not very important, but I actually think they're enormously important. I mean, my iPad allows me, wherever I am in the world, to talk to my grandchildren. It allows me to see pictures of them within minutes of the activities that we're doing, no matter how far away. My devices allow me access to almost all the world's music and all the world's literature at the touch of a button. The internet provides endless scope for entertaining activities, some much worthier than others, but still an enormous amount of free entertainment. Almost none of that is included in our GDP statistics. And so I think we've got ourselves into a somewhat difficult position where the most rapid technical progress is taking place in those areas where we can measure it worse. And I think that's a real problem. So I'm pretty optimistic about that. The question about the control of technology and the control of policy, I'm delighted that you raised Tony Atkinson's suggestion that governments set up committees that would control technological progress. And I hope that is, I had a very strong negative reaction when I read that. And this is the first time that someone's raised it. It's very interesting. I mean, one of it is a difference between Britain and the United States. I mean, in Britain, I think when I lived in Britain, I used to think that the government was generally a force for good, and that I too would have thought it was a very good idea for the government to decide which technologies were worth having and which ones were not. I now live in America, and the idea that the government would decide which technologies to allow and which ones are not fills me with absolute horror, because those committees would be controlled by the manufacturers, by all sorts of vested interests and so on. And I think the last people these committees would represent would be the people who are potentially benefiting from that technology. So I think those things are extraordinarily difficult. I think policies to control technology, to control inequality, are very difficult. On the control of inequality, I don't think we lack policy, or I don't think we lack tools. So I, was brought up to believe that you could change the distribution of income through tax policy, through public goods, and so on. And I don't think those tools have gone away. But certainly where I live, they're almost impossible to use because there's no public consensus in favor of controlling inequality in that way. So to me, it's not the lack of tools, it's the lack of understanding. And for me, one of my goals in life, in these days at least, is to help stimulate the debate on inequality and its consequences. It's a debate that really has not taken place much in the United States. The left has always argued that inequality is a really bad thing. The right has said inequality is no problem at all. And no one was really talking about it until the last decade. And I think the last decade has been characterized by big advances in data. We have a much better understanding of what's happening to distribution. And also because of the Great Recession and the fact that some of these people who were earning enormous sums of money seem to have at least potentially played a role in the Great Recession itself and on the austerity policies that followed, so that income distribution inequality seems to be a real problem. The macroeconomic aspects of, there being maybe too much innovation so that people don't have jobs anymore, I think that's very difficult. I'm very much more an observer of that debate than a real contributor to it. But one of the many things that terrifies me about slowing growth is that in a world in which growth is fairly steady, even if modest, say 2% or 1.5% a year, it's possible for everyone to get a little more every year. In a world in which there's no growth, the only way my life can get better is at the expense of someone else. That tends to make politics extraordinarily difficult and really quite poisonous. And I think the dysfunction in politics in Washington today is not unconnected to the slowing down of economic growth. And indeed, I think some of the people that are suffering from the epidemic that I talked about are very much the same people who are totally disaffected from politics, who would like to bring the whole system down, want to break the government. There's a real force of believing that the government is not working for people at all. And some of that is to do with the fact that those people have so little benefited. So that's partly slow growth, and it's partly rapidly growing inequality, so that what growth there is going to the very top of the distribution, and people at the bottom are getting very little. So there's real concern about all those issues. So thank you for these very stimulating comments, and I hope that we'll get a chance to talk about them again, perhaps in person and not too far from now. Thank you.
So many thanks, Professor Deaton. We have arrived at the end of this lecture, of this collection. Everything has gone well. And I would like to thank again you for your lecture, and the two discussants for their remarks and a question. And I will say bye-bye.
Thank you very much.